Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Brooke Rollins, and I have had the amazing privilege of leading the Texas Public Policy Foundation for the last 12 and a half years. It's hard to believe that when we started down the road that we're on today, that we had just a handful of employees and based in San Antonio. And today, you sit in what we believe to be the cradle of liberty and the headquarters for freedom, not just for Texas and really not just for America, but for the world. And so we are so grateful to all of you for joining us. Many of you may know this, but we just opened this building for business just about a month and a half ago. And so you'll see lots of, pardon our construction, pardon our dust. You'll see a lot of dust as you're making your way around the building, but we are so proud of it, and we are so glad. And what an incredible, I was talking to Arlene, our executive director, just a minute ago. I think this is really our first real substantive day-long policy event in this building. And what a gift for it to be on this topic. And for those of you who know me know that I am a very big Texas A&M Aggie. And last night, the Aggies had a baseball game playing to see who got to go to the World Series in Fort Worth. And I was actually at that game until 2 a.m. this morning, all 16 innings. But I say that not because I like to talk about Aggie baseball, but because I do want to note that I believe this is so important, and this topic is so, it's just got to be a priority moving forward for our state and our country, and getting it back on track, that I wanted to make sure I was here to say thank you to all of you in the audience for doing so very much, to thank many of you who are out in the field, making sure that this becomes a priority, and that anything we can do to make it so, we're here to do it. I am especially grateful to Dr. Steve Balch and Texas Tech University. I'll talk a little bit more about Dr. Balch in just a moment before I call him up, but this was his vision and his idea, and we're just so grateful and so proud to be a part of this, so thank you. You know, given the paramount importance of the study of Western civilization, perhaps all of us in this room, the reason we're here, we may all be a little shocked that we even need to hold a conference to justify its required study at our universities. After all, to ask whether students need to study Western civilization is the moral equivalent of asking whether it is important to investigate concepts such as representative democracy, freedom of speech and press, limited government, individual liberty, constitutionalism, human equality, inalienable rights, all of it. The list goes on and on. For all of these fundamental world transformative concepts are the products of Western civilization. Therefore, to ask whether we should know these things is to ask whether it is important to know ourselves. Yet, ask we must, and we must continue to ask, for the study of these concepts is, as we all know, again, while we're all here, it's on the decline. Let's take a look at a few of the statistics on this. As disheartening as it may be to do so, over 80% of American colleges and universities do not require students to take even one foundational course in American history. Not surprisingly, only 20% of college graduates can identify James Madison is the father of the Constitution. 17% of college graduates can correctly describe the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation. We've all heard these statistics. You've heard them again and again and again. But now we see and now we know that it has spread from the universities to our public education and high school classrooms. To quote a letter opposing the College Board's recent modifications of the AP U.S. History curriculum, which several of you here today have signed, the new version of the test will effectively marginalize important ways of teaching about the American past and force American high schools to teach U.S. history from a perspective that self-consciously seeks to decenter American history and subordinate it to a global and heavily social, scientific perspective. I am therefore, as I mentioned, so grateful that this event is taking place. For this event looks to help provide a roadmap for our country through which to restore the study of Western civilization to its proper place in higher education. Again, I am so grateful that the Texas Public Policy Foundation and that our wonderful team, led by many of you know Dr. Tom Lindsay on this issue, along with our partners, those of you who are in academia, that we can all come together and that we can all work to provide a better future and, in my opinion, to reclaim America. So what a gift to have you all here. Again, speaking of visionaries, I'd like to welcome Dr. Stephen H. Balch to the podium. He became the director of the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization in September of 2012. Before coming to Texas Tech, what to forgive him for that, he served for 25 years as founding president and chairman of the National Association of Scholars. During his years at the NAS, Dr. Balch worked to encourage universities and colleges across America to develop new academic programming dealing with Western civilization. And as we all know, he's written mightily on higher education issues for a variety of publications for so very many years. Please help me welcome the visionary behind today, Dr. Steve Balch.
Well, thank you very much, Brooke, for that wonderful introduction, and I want to thank the Texas Public Policy Foundation for cooperating with the Institute in putting together this great event and for giving us these magnificent quarters in which to hold it. I just am in awe of what the Texas Public Policy Foundation has been able to accomplish, and this building is a testament to its success and influence. I've been asked to note that your seats have little trays attached to them. Only in Western civilization could you find such artfully made seats. So if you want to kind of lift those up and you have a beverage or something like that, that you can do it. I'd also like, because I'm going to introduce them all together, and because I need their distinction to just radiate its strength to me, I'd like our panelists, wherever they are, to take this opportunity and to come up and seat themselves at the head table. I've been described as a visionary. I'm haunted by a vision, a sad and tragic vision, and that's the vision of Western civilization dying out in our universities and schools, and in consequence, dying out, because unless those institutions preserve it, unless those institutions provide for its continuance, it will indeed die out with all the blessings that it's provided. Now, when I say Western civilization is dying out in our universities and schools, I don't mean it isn't being studied. It's studied, alas, however, mainly in bits and pieces. Virtually all of contemporary education consists of the study of Western civilization. And the reason for that is that Western civilization is the world in which we now live. It's the world that has given us freedom. It's the world that has given us prosperity. It's the world that has given us a scientific understanding. It's the world that holds our Judeo-Christian heritage. There are parts of that world that aren't so wonderful, and some of the foes of Western civilization, though they would deny it, are themselves very Western. But Western civilization is the world, and the university can't help, if it's going to study anything at all, to study the West. What's no longer studied, however, in any type of, well, for the most part, in any type of formal program, is Western civilization as a phenomenon. That is to say, as an epic story of human achievement, whereby through freedom, reason, and individual enterprise, the world was liberated from the squalor, misery, and despotism that so long defined the human condition. It wasn't always like that. It wasn't like that during living memory, my own, for example, and a great many of those who are here in this room. In the middle of the 20th century, Following its victories over tyranny in the Second World War, American higher education saw itself and America as the West's defender. And this aspiration shaped its curriculum. When I went to college, which was Brooklyn College in New York City from, I have to date myself here, 1960 to 1964, all students were required to take 2 semesters of Western history. And not only that, but the history department there actually created a textbook on its own with readings, voluminous readings, for us to study it. And that wasn't exceptional. You've already heard some of the figures, but in 1964, 82% of America's 50 leading universities and colleges either required or very strongly encouraged, through the structure of the curriculum, students to take several courses in Western civilization. They were mainly history surveys. In 2010, NAS did this study, only 36% did. Even for history majors, Western civilization as an object of concentrated study is disappearing. 54% of our leading institutions required students, history majors, to take it back in 1964. In 2010, only 2% require it. Virtually vanished. I think the one school that did require it in the top 50 was William and Mary, and I'm not sure that's still true today. And the situation isn't much different in our major public universities and flagship schools. The trend line is steadily downward. Now, there are a lot of things that account for this. Some of it simply is academic specialization. People want to study very narrow things because that's how they make their scholarly careers, by being narrow rather than being broad. Multiculturalism is a phenomenon, and generalized dumbing down also is part of the mix. But there's another factor, and that is political correctness. And in many respects, it's the most important factor. Unlike the universities that many people in this room can still remember, today's university, and I'm talking about American universities as a whole, not any particular one necessarily, but as a whole, American universities, and very decidedly so, are more ashamed than proud of the West and America. They really don't see them as achievements. For many faculty members, Western civilization means, it means racist arrogance and the slave trade. It means imperial expansion and exploitation of the Third World. It means the subjugation of women, strangely enough. It means homophobia and all sorts of forms of Christian bigotry. And most recently, it's taken on another odious meaning for a great many, and that is the destruction of the earth itself. And this sensibility now pervades not only the universities, but teaching at all levels, as witness what's now being done to the AP exam. Civilizations need to be proud of themselves if they are going to survive, and so do republics and nations. And it is the erosion of this pride, it's the deconstruction of the West's once prideful heritage, both through a failure to communicate it and through a zeal to disparage it, that I'd argue is the greatest threat we face. And not just a threat in education, the greatest threat we face, period. That's true first because whatever our technological might, we will never muster the will to defend ourselves against external threats or internal threats unless we are first convinced that we have something worth defending. The uncertainty and self-delusion we now often show facing threats far weaker than those we surmounted not that long ago is a symptom of that deflated pride. Second, because people need to believe that they are part of worthy, honorable communities, including those very large communities that we call nations and civilizations. If they lose faith in a community to which they already belong, they'll look to others, other types of communities, to regain this sense of collective worth. I'd argue that we are now seeing in the United States its melting pot congealing into competing groups defined by race, ethnicity, sexual identity, and elite intellectualism that sets itself apart over and above other Americans, precisely because we have lost this common sense of self. The new tribalism that is taking over America is the result of the erasure of the grand narrative that once held us together. Western civilization is hardly perfect, but it has come closer to alleviating the age-old ills of mankind's estate than anything else, and has done so on an increasingly global scale. In reality, such global civilization as now exists, as I said before, is Western civilization, and it would be a supreme folly to let it wither through neglect and self-loathing. But to avoid this fate, we need a powerful voice within American education, and right now, Western civilization has very little. A revival of that voice must start with the creation of new academic programming, in the same way as programs in ethnic, women's, and other culturally critical enterprises were the first steps in eventually mainstreaming their concerns across campus. And these new Western programs must gain the ability to recruit faculty, since in the academy, as elsewhere, personnel is policy. Texas Tech's Institute for the Study of Western Civilization means to provide a model for such programs. And let me thank my university's unusually clear-sighted leadership and open-minded faculty for allowing it to begin and grow. And let me also say that however valuable, and they are very valuable, programs focused purely on free markets are not enough. Far from it. They are not enough because an explanation of market efficiencies in allocating resources and even market fairness in spreading the possibilities of choice is more mechanical than moral, more analysis than narration. People need narratives, stories, as well as analysis to draw full inspiration. These need to be honest stories, sophisticated ones certainly at the level of higher education, but stories nonetheless. Fortunately in the West and America, we have a great one to tell if only we had the chance. Having that chance requires support, the munificent support of those people looking for philanthropic investments in higher education that can do real and urgent good. Some have already come forward, but not nearly enough. And that's what this conference is about, encouraging our friends in the public who are already supporting higher education, as well as some who have pulled back out of cultural disillusion, to begin directing their support, be it gifts, be it public support in other means, through public decision-making bodies, to reviving Western civilization's voice on American campuses. This is very unlikely to happen if it's left wholly to internal university decision-making. It must be jump-started if it is to happen at all, and the day is late. Our appeal to you today, then, in varied ways, is to help make this so. This conference is divided into 3 parts, 2 panels and a lunch at which the man who brought me out to Texas Tech, former Chancellor Kent Hanssen, and it'll be a rare treat, will be our speaker. But of the 2 panels, the first deals with making Western civilization's case. What is that case? And the second with the challenges and opportunities involved in, practically speaking, making it today on our university's campuses. So let's start with the first, which is the case. And let me introduce the panelists. I'll introduce them from left to right. On my left, on my left. Well, whatever. Bob Paquette.
Never on the left.
That's never on the left, except in this one case. Bob Paquette is professor of American history at Hamilton College in New York and holds a PhD with honors from the University of Rochester. He is an authority on the history of slavery, and his book, Sugar is Made with Blood, received the Elsa Govia Prize. In 2007, he co-founded the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. Adjacent to, it's kind of offshore, but impinging on in all sorts of ways that make Hamilton College justifiably uncomfortable. Impinging upon Hamilton College. I'm on its board. And the Alexander Hamilton Institute, it should be noted, has affiliate programs at colleges in several other parts of the Northeast. In 2008, President Bush nominated him to the National Humanities Council. Next to him is Susan Hanssen, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Dallas. She holds a doctorate from Rice University and was a Garwood Fellow at the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, 1910-1911. She's published on a variety of subjects pertaining to American and British intellectual cultural history and has a book underway, Henry Adams and the Sanity and Suicide of America, timely title. She is particularly interested in the British roots of American liberty. Paul Rahe is professor of history at Hillsdale College. He's a former Rhodes Scholar with a PhD from Yale. His work has been focused on one of the central questions pertaining to Western uniqueness, the origins and evolution of institutions of self-government, and republics in particular. He is the author of 5 books, including Republics, Ancient and Modern, Classical Republicanism and the American Revolution, Soft Despotism, Democracy's Drift, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Tocqueville on the American Prospect, and in progress, The Spartan Way of War. Has that appeared? Or it's
I have the page proofs with me.
Oh, very good. Well, unless this building burns down right now, it shall appear shortly. And finally, but not least, Ibn Warraq, which is a nom de plume. He is best known for his critical works on Islam, including Why I'm Not a Muslim, which may tell you why it's his nom de plume. Born in India and having spent his earliest years in Pakistan, his father sent him to a British boarding school to escape what would otherwise have been an exclusively Muslim religious education. Later, he attended the University of Edinburgh, where he studied philosophy and Arabic with Islamic studies scholar W. Montgomery Watt. He is also an eloquent defender of Western civilization and a foe of the academic assaults upon it. He's produced 2 books on this subject. One, Defending the West, a critique of Edward Said's Orientalism, which came out in 2007, and then in 2011, Why the West is Best. I like that kind of straightforward title. A Muslim apostate's defense of liberal democracy. So in the order that, let's see, no, I think the order is actually going to be Paul Rahe, then Susan Hanssen, then Bob Paquette, and then Ibn Warraq. In that order, you will hear from this very distinguished panel. And thank you for being here. And I think you'll very much enjoy and be rewarded by what will happen next. So.
Shortly after the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson was approached by a friend, young person, asking him what to study. And in the new American situation, Jefferson suggested that he study the history of liberty. And that was constituted by the study of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, England, and America. I have 12 minutes to tell you about ancient Greece and Rome and everything up to England when Susie Hanssen will take over. I will use a broad brush. The civilization of the West, which is best represented, but not solely represented by Greece, Rome, Britain, and America, I think has three major components that distinguish it from that which is not the West. It's rendered an intelligible unit. It's distinguished from the alternatives by the three characteristics present nowhere else. The first is monotheism in religion. The second is philosophy and science as a means for understanding the natural world. And the third is self-government. The first originates with the Jews, the second and third with the Greeks. They become fully intertwined in the Middle Ages only under the aegis of Western Christianity. So let me say a little bit about these. No one knows quite when monotheism emerges, but the best evidence we have is from the Jewish Bible, and the clearest evidence that can't be doubted comes from Deutero-Isaiah, the second part of Isaiah, during the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. It's only there that Yahweh is identified as the only God that exists. It's only there that all the other gods are said to be imaginary. It's only there that the Jews, as God's chosen people, are called upon to sing to the Lord a new song, to be a light unto the nations. That is to say, to have a universal mission, and to bring justice to the nations. It's there that Cyrus, the king of Persia, who's not a Jew, is spoken of as Yahweh's shepherd, as his anointed, who shall fulfill his purpose by setting the exiles free. A non-Jew can be God's, who doesn't believe in Yahweh, can be used by Yahweh. It's only in Deutero-Isaiah that Yahweh summons the survivors of the nations from all the ends of the earth to turn to him and be saved. Now that happens in the 6th century BC. The timing of the shift in religious understanding deserves attention, I think, because it preceded the emergence of the second thing I talked about, science and philosophy, in Ionia only by a short time. These things more or less coincide, if in fact it didn't coincide fully. Xenophanes of Colophon, who was one of the pre-Socratics, lived in the day of Cyrus of Persia and was among those who were driven from Asia Minor by the Persian invasion. This is the same Cyrus of Persia who restores the Jews from the Babylonian captivity to Jerusalem. Now, this would be insignificant were it not for the fact that Aristotle tells us that Anaximander, another of the pre-Socratics, and apparently his predecessors as well, Thales and Anaximenes, these are all a little before Xenophanes of Colophon, believed that there was a single, limitless, omnipotent, immortal deity encompassing and controlling the universe. To put it in simple terms, the premise that lay behind the notion that science could understand nature was that nature reflected a single mind. If you go back to ancient Mesopotamia and you look at their pantheon, here's the way the gods made a decision. They got drunk. Really, really drunk. You know, I think probably some fraternities at the University of Texas might do this. And they made a decision when they were sober, and then they got stupefied and made the same decision. And if the two coincided, then they went forward with it. If you look at the god Zeus in the Iliad, his activities are controlled by his passions. At one point, he is seduced by, of all things, his wife. And this has a big impact on the war. In other words, the vision you get of the gods, of the Greek gods and of the Mesopotamian gods, of the multiplicity of gods, is they're just as irrational as you are. But the account that you get in Xenophanes is as follows. One God there is. This is not a Jew. It's a Greek in the 6th century. greatest among gods and men, in no way like mortal creatures, either in bodily form or in the thought of his mind. The whole of him sees, the whole of him thinks, the whole of him hears. He stays always motionless in the same place. It is not fitting that he should move about now this way, now that. But effortlessly he wields all things by the thought of his mind. Two things to note. He's bodiless. He wields everything by the thought of his mind. And he always stays motionless in the same place because it is not fitting that he should move about now this way, now that. This God conforms to that which is fitting. He's not willful. He does what is fitting. Mortal men imagine the gods are begotten. Think of the Greek gods and the Mesopotamian gods. That they have human dress and shape and speech. If oxen or horses or lions had hands to draw with and to make works of art as men do, then horses would draw the forms of God like horses, oxen like men, and they would make their gods' bodies similar to the bodily shape that they themselves each had. Note that as a kind of form of criticism of pagan religion. That it's a projection of oneself. The Ethiopians say that their gods are snub-nosed and black-skinned. The Thracians that they are blue-eyed and red-headed. Note what that implies, a rejection of ethnocentrism. In other words, reason is universal. Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods everything which brings shame and reproach among men, theft, adultery, and fraud. Okay, that happens, and it is involved with the emergence of science, that is to say, the study of nature as such, in the 6th century. At about the same time, the Jews find their way to monotheism. What makes this interesting, even further, is that the original philosopher, Thales, is said to have been a Phoenician in Herodotus. That is to say, he is said to have been a speaker of the language Aramaic. By this, Herodotus means that he hailed from the region encompassing greater Syria, the region whence came the alphabet. Now, Diogenes Laertius cites a report from the 3rd century biographer Hermippus of Smyrna that the same Thales expressed gratitude for 3 blessings: that he was born a man, not a woman, a man, not an animal, a man, not a woman, and a Greek, not a barbarian. He'd be probably ejected from his tenure at most universities. Now, this piece of evidence is late, but it may be revealing. Phoenicia, as the Greeks used the term, included Canaan. And the blessings putatively acknowledged by Thales are almost identical to the 3 blessings putatively, customarily singled out in a prayer customarily said each morning by Orthodox Jewish men who pray to Yahweh, thanking him that they are born men, not animals, men, not women, and Jews, not goyim. Note, it's almost identical. We do not know when this practice originated, this Orthodox Jewish practice. It is quite possible, however, that it has very early antecedents. St. Paul seems to have been reacting against something of the sort when he told the Galatians, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor slave nor free, nor male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. I mention all of this about Thales and this prayer business and the report that he hailed ultimately from Phoenicia, because there may be a link between the monotheism of the Ionian natural philosophers, represented by Xenophanes, whose material I just read to you, and that of the Jewish Bible. It could be that the God of the philosophers is a descendant of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that Thales may have been an ancient Spinoza, that religious theoria may have inspired its philosophical analog. That is to say that the 2 species of universalism, monotheism and science, that became visible in the 6th century may have had a common root. There's, however, another intriguing possibility. The notion of science is tied up very closely with the word cosmos. But the word cosmos was a political word in its origins. That is to say, it had to do with the order of a city. It was called a cosmos long before it was picked up by the philosophers. And a lot of the language used by these early philosophers is political language, language of Greek politics. So let me come back to this. I want to suggest all three of these things are tied up with one another. The key thing that distinguishes the West from the rest is logos. That is to say, the idea that rational speech is the best way of sorting things out. It begins among the Greeks with the way they organize their cities, with the decision-making that takes place in assemblies in which speeches are heard and voting takes place. It passes to the natural world. If speech is the best way to sort out the political world, could rational speech be the best way to sort out the natural world? And it is also connected with the idea of one God. The beginning of the Gospel of John, as all of you know, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Except that's not what it says. That's what it says in an English translation. In Greek it says, "In the beginning was Logos." In the beginning was rational speech. And rational speech was with God, and God is rational speech. Now, what that means is, in the Gospel of John, the religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob gets joined with the religion of Xenophanes, with a God that only does that which is fitting. That is the premise that distinguishes the rest from the West, the West from the rest. And it gets passed on, as does the practice of self-government. I want to end with one simple point. Self-government dies out with the Roman Empire, but the idea doesn't die out because it survives in corporations, in private entities. And they have a principle, and it has to do with rivers and people who live along the rivers. Quod omnes tanget ab omnibus tractari debeat. That which touches all, and this river does touch everybody who lives along it, should by all be dealt with. Meaning, the people upstream can't take all the water. You need a corporation to manage the river so that everyone who lives along the river is treated fairly. It's got to be an elected organization, elected by the people who are touched on by it, or they must meet to make these decisions. That principle is picked up by the Roman Catholic Church, and it becomes a principle of canon law. It explains why abbots elect the head of the order, why canons of the cathedral elected bishops, why the College of Cardinals elected the Pope. It gets passed on in the Middle Ages to the monarchies of Europe, so that when Edward III calls the first parliament, that is to say, when he first calls the burghers, the people from the towns, to parley, the man who issues this on his behalf quotes this principle. So it goes from canon law, quod omnes tanget ab omnibus tractari debeat, into English municipal law. And the same thing happens all across Europe. And it doesn't die out. I've been recently rereading documents of the American Revolutionary period. One of the very first of the Stamp Act tracts attacking the English Stamp Act, and by the way, it's 250 years now, right after the Stamp Act. You won't see this in your newspapers. March 22nd, 2015 is 250 years after the passage of the Stamp Act. In one of the very first of the Stamp Act tracts, the point about no taxation without representation is justified by quoting quod omnes tanget ab omnibus tractari debeat. It's a principle of English law. John Dickinson quotes it in a tract he writes later calling for ratification of the American Constitution. So that principle, which goes back to the Middle Ages, back to canon law, back to the Roman law of private corporations, and encapsulates the idea that is there with the Greek polis, with meeting together in an assembly to reach decisions concerning common matters, There's a line that runs all the way along. There's continuity there. And it is tied up with this fundamental principle that the best way to sort things out is through rational speech. Thank you.
So I wanted to begin from the famous image that some of you have. I wanted to begin from the famous image of the survival of St. Paul's Cathedral in London during the bombing of Britain in World War II. This famous image of the dome of St. Paul's, rising above the black smoke of the Blitz, has served in our communal memory as a backdrop to Winston Churchill's stirring wartime speeches. In particular, the dome of St. Paul's came to symbolize London itself holding out against Nazi Germany, or what Churchill always called a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. He didn't like to refer to Germany. Germany was a nation, as England had been a nation, as Russia had once been a nation, as France was a nation. But what they were dealing with was not a nation. They were dealing with an ideologized state, a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. That year, when Great Britain fought on against Nazi Germany without any allies on the European continent, that one impressive year from June 1940 to June 1941, from the surrender of France to the attacks which brought the Soviet Union and the United States reluctantly and belatedly into the war, that year has been immortalized in Churchill's phrase, Britain's finest hour. And if the British Empire and its Commonwealth should last for 1,000 years, men would say this was their finest hour. During that year, Churchill called London a great city of refuge. And that phrase is the title for my short talk today, a great city of refuge. And indeed, refugees were literally flooding into London from all over Nazi-occupied Europe. Refugees like both the cast and characters of the movie Casablanca, made in 1942, escaping their invaded homelands, Polish fighter pilots, Jewish children, and the governments in exile of all the shattered states and bludgeoned nations of Nazi-occupied Europe. So I wanted to start with this image. I wanted to just have us reflect for a moment on whether this image resonates with you in your memory, as a part of your communal memory, if you've ever seen it before. And if any of these phrases that I've used, Britain's finest hour, a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime, are something that you have in your own memory. And I want us to reflect just a little bit on the difference between knowing and not knowing. To know or not to know that image, to know or not to know that voice or that story as a part of our communal memory, because it's from our communal memory that we get our communal identity. I was not alive during World War II. I am not British. But this image and that voice and those ideals are part of my patrimony as someone who lives in a free country and has benefited from the sacrifices made during that year. So they are our patria, right? And we can have patriotism towards them, whether or not, right, we are ethnically related to those who fought, right? It's a part of the community and the identity of our civilization. Because London had become literally a haven for refugees, Churchill could say, we are fighting by ourselves alone, but we are not fighting for ourselves alone. Here, in this strong city of refuge, which enshrines the title deeds of human progress and is of deep consequence to Christian civilization, here, girt about by the seas and oceans where the Navy reigns, shielded from above by the prowess and devotion of our airmen, we await, undismayed, the impending assault. I think the emphasis on the word here there is very interesting because Lincoln makes the same emphasis on the word here in the Gettysburg Address. I have my students memorize the Gettysburg Address every year, and I think there are 7 or 8 heres, I should know that, and getting them in the right spot is very important, not saying a sort of preemptive here where there shouldn't be a here, and what. But the central here, the first here in the Gettysburg Address, is the here where those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It's a sacred here, right, of those who've sacrificed, right, to give us a patria. And that here belongs to anyone, right, who lives in what was created here, right, the idea of being attached to that soil as a sacred place. I begin with this image of St. Paul's Cathedral during the Blitz, of London as a great city of refuge, which enshrines the title deeds of human progress, it's a reference to the Magna Carta, and is of deep consequence to Christian civilization. And I think in some sense Churchill was sort of recovering, and even Great Britain was recovering during World War II, their Christian identity with the help of C.S. Lewis's BBC Wartime Talks, which became his best-selling Mere Christianity. I begin with this image of the great city of refuge because London during the year 1940 to 1941 was a small microcosm of what the United States of America has been for the entirety of its history. A city of refuge. America has been a strong city of refuge for the peoples of the shattered states and bludgeoned nations of the world. That's our history for 300 years. I want to talk briefly today about how the United States has also been a refuge for the very idea of what it means to be a nation. In some sense, you could say the most important refugee that we ever gave welcome on our soil and protected was an idea, right? The idea of the nation. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln at Gettysburg prayed that that nation would have a new birth of freedom and that it would once more be a nation under God. Now, those of you, who are a little bit Gettysburg Address scholars know that the under God phrase was not in his notes, that he ad-libbed it in the moment. It was picked up by all the reporters and telegraphed back to the newspapers all across the United States of America. So if you go and look in the archives and the newspapers, it was there. And then in the copy that he signed afterwards, the 2 copies that he signed afterwards, they both had the under God phrase. And the under God phrase is also inscribed on the Lincoln Memorial in marble. He prayed that that nation would once more be a nation under God. But he ad-libbed the under God phrase. It was not originally in his notes because he considered it a redundancy. To say a nation under God is redundant. A nation means nation under God as opposed to the state as God. Liberty under law is a redundancy. Liberty under law means liberty as opposed to license. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's gave birth to the idea of a nation. In case we'd forgotten that a nation has to be, a nation's powers has to be limited by the existence of the laws of nature and nature's God, Lincoln ad-libbed the under God phrase. I think that Pierre Manent, a French scholar, has done a wonderful job pointing out the distinctiveness of the idea of a nation. He argues that in antiquity, the 2 conceptions of government were the city and the empire, the polis and the imperium. Both were absolute governments of a sort. The ancient polis had absolute jurisdiction within its walls, and allegiance to the gods of the city was absolute. The ancient imperium claimed universal jurisdiction over all conquered territory and peoples, and all the gods of the subject peoples were welcomed into the imperial pantheon of Rome. Manent argues that only with the rise of Christianity, with the appearance of a religion that did not desire temporal secular sovereignty, that did not intend to form a government, that was not a sacred law like the Mosaic Code or Sharia, but rather an offering of grace to fulfill the laws of nature and nature's God discernible by human reason, only with the rise of such a religion did the absolute jurisdictional and territorial claims of the polis and the empire get tamed. There arose a very through a very messy process of a millennium in Europe, the idea of a nation limited in territory and limited in jurisdiction, respecting the law of nations, plural, use gentium, and the natural law, jurisdiction of families, the church, corporations, guilds, even the local claims of independent cities, and the valuable role of the empire in defense and the maintenance of peace. The idea of a nation is symbiotic with the idea of a plurality of nations. Nationalism, the idea that there's only one nation and that's going to be us, right? Nationalism is a deformed modern creation. In the older tradition, piety to God, family, and country meant respecting the piety of others to God, family, and country as well. Patriotism, as a virtue, was very different from the nationalism which arose in the modern period as European nations headed back in the direction of becoming centralized imperial states. France tried to conquer all of Europe in the Napoleonic Wars. Great Britain became the first empire in which the sun never set. Germany had a go at global domination. Soviet Russia also aimed at world government justified by the ideology of communism. Throughout this modern history of the rise of the modern nation state in Europe and its imperial expansion across the world, America has been the inheritor and torchbearer for the idea of the nation. The American founders championed the older ancient liberties of Englishmen, the unwritten English Constitution of the independence of the church from the state, the balance of powers of the legislature, executive, and judiciary, the separation of local and federal jurisdictions, the natural law rights of families and corporations and individuals inscribed in both the common law and in bills of rights. This was a long-standing English tradition of liberty that the original colonists brought with them to British North America. These were ideas that were inscribed in the Magna Carta and admired by Montesquieu. The British colonists were used to freedom. Like Aeneas fleeing Troy, carrying his father on his shoulders and clutching his household gods and leading his son by the hand, the British colonists brought a long tradition of liberty inherited from Christian civilization of Europe that was being destroyed in the modern period. Every later group of immigrants to the United States of America has arguably felt the same push of the rising power of a centralized government behind them and the pull of a nation, a limited government, liberty under law, a nation under God, freedom, in front of them. When Tolkien described the Shire during the dark days of the bombing of Britain during World War II as a land of hobbits who had maintained a free and prosperous existence, although just a little clueless about the fact that freedom isn't free, he could have been describing the American Midwest. It's the Shire. It's a bunch of hobbits. Right? And Winston Churchill had to fly out to Fulton, Missouri, right, to tell us about our responsibilities in the Cold War, gave his Iron Curtain speech as a graduation speech, right, in Missouri to the hobbits of the Midwest. We took it on, I think, very well. World War II was a coming of age for the Americans. It was the moment when we realized our responsibility as a nation to care for the whole community of nations. We are fighting by ourselves alone, but we are not fighting for ourselves alone. Teaching the British contribution to an understanding of American civilization is a way of passing on to future generations an understanding of how distinctive America's idea of a nation is and how valuable it is as an inspiring model of freedom for the rest of the world. Thank you.
Mine is a voice that doesn't need a microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, 35 years ago, I began my academic career at Hamilton College as a rather rough-hewn, starry-eyed instructor who tended to look upon institutions of higher education as vibrant little cities on the hill, not as safe spaces immured by ivy-covered stone walls, but as unsafe zones in which serious people gathered freely and openly, armed with evidence and argument, to do battle with ideas. Never in my wildest dreams could I have imagined that 35 years later, I would be invited to a conference in the great state of Texas where the task at hand is to defend those American and Western forces holed up in a kind of academic bastion against the advancing panzer units of the campus totalitarians who have demanded unconditional surrender. No, I will not be filling this morning the role of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, for I have more to say than nuts. The finest traditions of liberal arts education in the United States at elite colleges have unraveled slowly but surely with the active complicity of academic leadership that seems more interested in comity rather than quality, form rather than substance, and fashion rather than prescription. Make no mistake, the cultural radicals ensconce themselves on campus through the front door, rather quickly, and once inside, made no secret of their ambitions to practice transformational politics. Preaching diversity allowed them to build, person by person, program by program, department by department, a like-minded majority. Once a majority, they wedded democracy to diversity so that they could shape the content of almost every important committee on policy and appointment. Even the most courageous and able conservative president would have a tough time reclaiming so much as a tongue of land from the multiple fiefdoms lorded over on campus in the social sciences and humanities by the activist grandees. A retired colleague asked me recently why the usual suspects appeared to have quieted down a bit. I responded, they're probably weeping, for like Alexander, what worlds have they left to conquer? 35 years of teaching on one and only one campus does have its advantages in trying to understand the rather remarkable process by which the unum of a civic culture that once stood as a beacon light to the rest of the world was pushed to the margin by an academic vanguard to replace by a pluribus of lavishly funded activist workshops, programs, and studies populated by professors, most of whom have a sneering contempt for American exceptionalism. For a few minutes, let's conduct a thought experiment, what the academic left likes to call reimagining. Contemplate an elite college with a proud 200-year tradition of liberal arts education. It is no longer a shining little village on the hill, but a valley of the pharaohs with $1 billion endowment for 1,800 students. Betraying the very ethos of a traditional liberal arts education, the college has moved to an open curriculum, a not so clever way of saying there is no curriculum. Many students are graduated with transcripts more manicured than Caitlyn Jenner's fingernails, such that the 70+% of all their courses are taken in only 2 disciplines, which could be as closely allied as Hispanic studies and Africana studies. Student tour guides tout the open curriculum as a way to avoid classes, so as to lure high school students and their parents down a 4-year yellow brick road that is supposed to end in sweet happiness, although as it turns out, not necessarily to good-paying jobs. Minority students, many of whom were admitted largely free of charge as a result of need-blind admissions, experience the practical operation of this open curriculum as a cruel hoax. Informed by the soft bigotry of low expectations, for they tend to be siloed into classes of low standards and deep politicization by activist professors and by a growing army of administrative diversity gurus. Grade inflation is so bad that an average of 82, B-, would plant you pretty much at the bottom of your class. English professors no longer teach composition. English majors need not take one course in Shakespeare. Indeed, a move is underway, for the sake of political peace, to abolish the English department entirely, to be replaced by something to be called generously literature in creative writing. The quantitative literacy standard on the campus is so low that an intelligent 8th grader could pass the test. The history department requires majors to take at least 3 courses in non-Western history, but requires only 1 mandatory course in American history. By the way, up from 0 a few years ago. In 2007, 1/3 of all history majors were graduated without having taken 1 course in American history. Many graduating seniors, perhaps even a majority, graduate from this elite campus possessed of a far greater understanding of the intricacies of sex toys than of the complexities of the Constitution. The economics department has more Marxists than practitioners of the Austrian school. Economic majors will graduate knowing far more about sustainability and the religion of global warming than about the likely unsustainability of personal freedom without the firm protection for private property rights. Let me pause here. As some of you may have guessed, I have not reimagined an elite liberal arts college. I have described my own institution, Hamilton College, and indeed, with occasional modifications, my description could apply to many of Hamilton College's peer institutions. I'm thinking of places like Swarthmore, Williams, Bowdoin, and so on. To counter this educational infamia, the independent Alexander Hamilton Institute, devoted, as our charter states, to the study of freedom, democracy, and capitalism, as these ideas were developed and institutionalized in the United States and within the larger tradition of Western culture. What started out in 2006 on sandy ground as an on-campus center now thrives a mile off campus as an independent scholarly center after the administration at Hamilton College reneged under political pressure on a signed agreement. Curiously enough, in the process of negotiating the original agreement, both the president of Hamilton College and its dean of the faculty at separate meetings stunned me by asking me the very same question: why Western civilization? For they wanted me to excise the words "for the study of Western civilization" from the center that I had proposed in the name of Alexander Hamilton, the college's namesake. I responded to both dean and president in words that echo language that became part of the HI's charter. First, the idea of personal freedom had no equivalent in the vocabularies of non-Western civilizations until imported from the West. Second, democracy first flourished in the city-states of ancient Greece. Third, while the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange seems to have been inscribed in humanity's genes, a full-blown capitalist system, one based on the private ownership of the non-personal means of production, originated in England. Does not modernity, I said to them, imply to a great extent the momentous extension in elaboration of these ideas around the world? For most of human history, populations the world over have been locked in Malthusian cycles. Every period of increasing per capita income, whether along the banks of the Nile, behind the wall of China, or at the mouth of the Tiber, was followed by a period of decreasing income that consumed previous gains. Not until the late 18th century in the Western world was there for the first time in human history a momentous breakout, a crossing of a threshold of human populations into self-sustained economic growth. Plotted on a graph, the line would look essentially flat from 1000 AD to the time of Jefferson's presidency, when the line spikes up as if shot through the roof. As a professional historian, I teach multiple classes in American history. The animating principles of that great experiment in Republican government, I tell my students, centered on limited government, voluntary exchange, private property, and civil freedom. The American Revolution was propelled by a paradoxical people who, in 1775, numbered among the freest and most prosperous people on the planet, but people who feared that their cherished liberties, rooted in the freehold, that is, privately owned landed property, were being placed at risk by an imperial government that was threatening to reduce them to servitude by exercising arbitrary and despotic power in defiance of custom and positive law. Does anyone in this audience this morning believe that more than a tiny fractions of students graduate from college these days with a deep and abiding appreciation of the worth of this country's founding principles, the pillars of the Palladium? Or is it more likely that a substantial number of students graduate able to parrot one or another fashionable and distortional discourses of oppression in which we see, and here I paraphrase from any number of college catalogs, the intersections of class, race, gender, and sexuality? Defense of vital constitutional principles, as James Madison insisted to Thomas Jefferson, ultimately rests not with parchment barriers, the Constitution, but with the spirit of a people. The spirit of a people draws energy from tradition. Tradition consists of deposited wisdoms that often lie buried deep in the past and require endless rediscovery and cultivation. Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist No. 1, has provided the words that have become a kind of epigraph for the mission of the AHI. In trying to ensure the survival of that great experiment in Republican government by framing a new Constitution, Hamilton addressed the public about the great task at hand. And here I end with a quote. "It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force." By accident and force, Hamilton meant monarchy, the accident of genealogy. And by force, he meant Caesarism. To me, that passage about the promise and peril of self-rule echoes as loudly today as it did more than 200 years ago. Thank you.
I, on the other hand, do need a microphone. I should be given slightly longer times, and I speak very slowly. I do everything very slowly. Okay. On October the 9th, 2007, I participated in a debate which was organized by Intelligence Squared in London to consider the motion, very awkwardly worded, "We should not be reluctant to assert the superiority of Western values." Muslim intellectual Tariq Ramadan, along with Charles Glass and William Dalrymple, spoke against the motion. On my side were Douglas Murray, journalist, political analyst, and writer, and David Aronovich, a journalist at the Times of London. My team, in fact, won hands down by 465 votes to 264 votes. You can in fact see the whole debate on video. In fact, as my friend Douglas Murray pointed out at the time, being gay, he would not have been able to carry out such a debate in any Islamic country. And I, as an apostate, I'm a Muslim apostate, would have been executed in an Islamic country, at least imprisoned. And of course, all the classical Muslim jurists prescribe the death penalty for apostasy. In fact, it was obvious that our side had won the debate before we had even begun, and I suspect that the 264 people who voted against us were simply rather embarrassed about the phrasing that we should not assert the superiority of Western values. As some of our panelists have already said, in fact, many liberals in the West refuse to use or cringe, actually cringe at the use of the term Western civilization. As something which I've witnessed amongst former colleagues when I worked up in upstate New York. Anyway, this is a part of my speech at the time. The great ideas of the West, rationalism, self-criticism, the disinterested search for truth, the separation of church and state, the rule of law, equality before the law, freedom of conscience and expression, human rights, liberal democracy, together constitute quite an achievement, surely, for any civilization. This set of principles remain the best and perhaps the only means for all people, no matter what race or creed, to live in freedom and to reach their full potential. Western values, the basis of the West's self-evident economic, social, political, scientific, and cultural success, are clearly superior to any other set of values devised by mankind. When Western values have been adopted by other societies, such as Japan or South Korea, their citizens have reaped benefits. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This triptych succinctly defines the attractiveness and superiority of Western civilization. In the West, we are free to think what we want, to read what we want, to practice our religion, to live as we choose. Liberty, as codified in human rights, a magnificent Western creation, but also, I believe, a universal good. Human rights transcend local or ethnocentric values, conferring equal dignity and value on all humanity, regardless of sex, ethnicity, sexual preference, or religion. At the same time, it is in the West that human rights are most respected. It is the West that has liberated women, racial minorities, religious minorities, and gays and lesbians, recognizing and defending their rights. The notions of freedom and human rights were present at the dawn of Western civilization, as ideals at least, but have gradually come to fruition through supreme acts of self-criticism. Because of its exceptional capacity for self-criticism, the West took the initiative in abolishing slavery. The calls for the abolition did not resonate even in black Africa, where rival African tribes took black prisoners to be sold as slaves in the West. Today, many non-Western cultures follow customs and practices that are clear violations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. In many countries, especially Islamic ones, you're not free to read what you want. Under Sharia or Islamic law, women are not free to marry whom they wish, and their rights of inheritance are circumscribed. Sharia, that's the Islamic law, derived from the Quran and the practice and the sayings of Muhammad the Prophet, prescribes barbaric punishments such as stoning to death for adultery. It calls for homosexuals and apostates to be executed. In Saudi Arabia, among other countries, Muslims are not free to convert to Christianity, and Christians are not free to practice their faith. The Quran is not itself a rights-respecting document. Under Islam, life is a closed book. Everything has been decided for you. The dictates of Sharia and the whims of Allah set strict limits on the possible agenda of your life. In the West, we have the choice to pursue our desires and ambitions. We are free as individuals to set the goals and determine the contents of our lives and to decide what meaning to give to our lives. As Roger Scruton remarks, quote, "The glory of the West is that life is an open book," end of quote. The West has given us the liberal miracle of individual rights and responsibility and merit. Rather than the chains of inherited status, Western society offers unparalleled social mobility. The West, as Alan Kors remarks, quote, "is a society of ever richer, more varied, more productive, more self-defined, and more satisfying lives." Instead of the mind-numbing certainties and dictates of Islam, Western civilization offers what Bertrand Russell once called liberating doubt. Even the process of politics in the West involves trial and error, open discussion, criticism, and self-correction. The quest for knowledge, no matter where it leads, a desire inherited from the Greeks, has produced an institution that is rarely equaled outside the West, the university. The outside world recognizes the superiority of Western universities. Easterners come to the West to learn not only about the sciences developed in the last 500 years, but also about their own cultures, about Eastern civilization and languages. They come to Oxford and Cambridge, to Harvard and Yale, to Heidelberg and Sorbonne to acquire their doctorates because these degrees confer prestige unrivaled by similar credentials from third world countries. Western universities, research institutes, and libraries are created to be independent institutions where the pursuit of truth is conducted in a spirit of disinterested inquiry, free from political pressures. The basic difference between the West and the rest might be summed up as a difference in epistemological principles. Behind the success of modern Western societies, with their science and technology and their open institutions, lies a distinct way of looking at the world, interpreting it and rectifying problems by lifting them out of the religious sphere and treating them empirically, finding solutions in rational procedures. The whole edifice of modern science is one of Western man's greatest gifts to the world. The West is responsible for almost every major scientific discovery of the last 500 years, from heliocentrism and telescope to electricity and computers. The West has given the world the symphony and the novel, a culture that engendered the spiritual creations of Mozart and Beethoven, Wagner and Schubert, of Raphael and Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci and Rembrandt, does not need lessons in spirituality from societies whose vision of heaven resembles a cosmic brothel stocked with virgins for men's pleasures. The West gave us the Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and many other manifestations of the humanitarian impulse. It is the West that provides the bulk of the aid to beleaguered Darfur, while southern Sudan, while Islamic countries are conspicuous by their absence. The West does not need lectures on the superior virtue of societies where women are kept in subjection, endure genital mutilation, are married off against their will at the age of 9, have acid thrown in their faces, or are stoned to death for alleged adultery, or where human rights are denied to those regarded as belonging to lower castes. The West does not need sanctimonious homilies from societies that cannot provide clean drinking water or sewage systems for their populations, that cannot educate their citizens but leave 40 to 50% of them illiterate, that make no provision for the handicapped, that have no sense of the common good or civic responsibility, that are riddled with corruption. No Western politician would be able to get away with the kind of racist remarks that are tolerated in the Third World, such as the anti-Semitic diatribes of the Malaysian leader Mahathir Mohamad. Instead, there would be calls for resignation both from the Third World leaders and from Western media and intellectuals. Double standards, undoubtedly, yes, but also a tacit acknowledgement that we expect higher ethical standards from the West. The Ayatollah Khomeini once famously said, "There are no jokes in Islam." The West is able to look at its own foibles and laugh, make fun of its own fundamental principles. There is no Islamic equivalent to Monty Python's Life of Brian. Can we look forward to seeing the life of Mo any time in the future? The rest of the world recognizes the virtues of the West in concrete ways. Millions of people risk their lives trying to get to the West, not to Saudi Arabia or Iran or Pakistan. They flee from theocratic or rather totalitarian regimes to find tolerance and freedom in the West, where life is an open book. As Arthur Schlesinger remarked, quote, "When Chinese students cried and died for democracy in Tiananmen Square, they brought with them not representations of Confucius or Buddha, but a model of the Statue of Liberty." That was my speech. Do I still have time? Okay. It so happened that the way the debate was structured, the last word fell to me of the 6 people who were speaking in the debate. During our debate, we had been discussing Tariq Ramadan's rather equivocal remarks about having a moratorium on stoning to death for adultery. He would not explicitly condemn it. He said we should just have a moratorium. And so I remarked that this is my final words and the final words of the whole debate. This is a joke, so you mustn't take it too literally and hold it against me. I said, I'd much rather I do not wish to live in a society where you are stoned for adultery. I prefer to live in a society where you get stoned first and then commit adultery. I have just a few words I need to say about Edward Said and his influence on Western universities, which has been quite extraordinary. His book, Orientalism, was voted the most important non-fiction book by the readers of The Guardian in England of the last 200 years. He's one of the most incredible, he must be the greatest charlatan of the 20th century, he really must. Anyway, here's a quick take on Edward Said. I've written a whole book for nearly 400 pages on it if you wish to pursue this further. Edward Said, who died on September 2003, was professor of English and comparative literature at Columbia University, and the author of more than 20 books on cultural history, cultural, literary, and political subjects. Said also defended the Palestinian cause with a passion and a rage, writing influential books on conflicts such as the question of Palestine. Arguably, his most influential, in my view, the most pernicious work was Orientalism, which came out in 1978, giving birth to entire new disciplines such as post-colonial studies, influencing several others such as subaltern studies. Universities around the world heaped honors on Said. From the Oxford Classical Dictionary, the novels of Jane Austen, Kipling, and George Eliot, to a book on Mozart's operas, one can see Said's influence at work in all the humanities, almost negating centuries of Western scholarship of the highest order. For a number of years now, Islamologists have been aware of the disastrous effect of Said's Orientalism on their discipline. Said's influence has resulted in a fear of asking and answering potentially embarrassing questions, ones which might upset Muslim sensibilities. Said's influence makes cross-cultural judgments well nigh impossible. Said deliberately misrepresents the work of distinguished scholars such as Richard Southern and Raymond Schwab. Scholars such as Justice Reed Weiner have also shown how Said fabricated all sorts of autobiographical information concerning his life in Palestine and Egypt. Can I have just two minutes? Thank you. Said's Orientalism gave those unable to think for themselves a formula. His work had the attraction of an all-purpose tool, which is acolytes, eager, intellectually unprepared, aesthetically unsophisticated, could apply to every cultural phenomenon without having to think critically or without having to conduct any real archival research requiring mastery of languages or research in the field requiring the mastery of techniques and rigorous methodology. So I should stop. Sorry. Okay, I overstepped my. Okay.
There isn't enough to be said for Western civilization and its defense, and I wish we had more time to say it. But that's the time we have. We have a 15-minute break, I understand, or is it a little less than that now? A 5-minute break, okay. However, during that break, if you'd like to come up and ask some questions to our panelists, I'm sure they'll be happy to remain seated that long. So we'll be back with you in another 5 minutes.
I'm a member of that group. I taught at Texas A&M for 24 years. And while I was on the faculty senate, this is just to play off some of the things that have been said, they passed an early multiculturalism part of the core curriculum, and I'd taken the opportunity to run for faculty senate just because I knew there would be that kind of malarkey coming along, and I wanted to be able to be there to be opposed to it. And in engineering, it's easy to get elected if you're conservative, right? Most engineers are pretty sensible kind of people. But not to say that other people aren't, but we had an opportunity there which worked out really well. The Alumni Association is often much more conservative than the university is. And I think we were able, when they actually passed the bill in the faculty senate to have multiculturalism, which had required courses you could choose from a list of about 4, and it was like radical feminism, it was gay, lesbian stuff. It had nothing to do with China or India or I could have been for a legitimate multiculturalism course, but it wasn't that. And so we were able to put out through the network, and today that's easy with internet, and the university got probably 1,000 calls within 2 days saying, we'll never give another penny to your school if you approve this for your core curriculum. And they went, either the regents told the president or the president read the writing on the wall and said, they just canned it. The faculty senate at most schools is advisory. It ultimately doesn't have the decision-making power, I think, at least at the universities I've worked at. And so I think a lot of times when we're talking about alums not giving money, that's one thing you can do. But the other thing is if we can somehow network and get people to do that. But I think the National Association of Scholars could potentially also help encourage their members. The materials you put out are extremely helpful in terms of what the battle's about, but in terms of strategic things they can do outside of just trying to be a good foot soldier in their department can make a big difference.
Well, we're a membership organization with about 3,000 members, and
Yeah.
we're more concentrated in some states than the others. There has to be a kind of critical mass of faculty members to accomplish something.
Well, it doesn't take many to contact the alums, though. Okay, there were only a few of us that did that, and if the alums get all angry, then they can make a big difference. Money speaks, and I think most universities can be bought one way or the other.
Let me just close by saying that I mentioned at our breakfast this morning that it's hard to imagine, given the state of our country today, an issue more important than the one that we're discussing here this morning. Ronald Reagan said that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. Where do universities fit in this? George Will answered in the negative shortly after 9/11 when he said, "We cannot defend what we cannot define." Right? This meeting, which seeks to restore the study of Western civilization, hopes to enable the next generation again to define what Western civilization is and thus who they are. And I want to thank you all for being part of the fight. Thank you.